Our next guest is Will van der Hart. Will has been an Anglican priest in London for 17 years. He's also the director of the Mind and Soul Foundation. I'm just going to bring Will in, or we're going to just let him get going. His interest in emotional health is wide-ranging, reflecting his broad experience in a variety of pastoral contexts. Oh, you're on your side there, Will. Do you want to just flip yourself around? That's brilliant. Thank you. Will is an experienced life coach, author, and integrative Bible teacher who speaks at a number of national forums. He's a mental health first aider and is passionate about equipping church leaders to look after their own emotional health, as well as empowering them to manage the emotional needs of their congregations. And that's such a vital thing. Certainly that's come to the fore in the last couple of years, hasn't it, Will, that people's mental health and well-being, particularly church leaders, has become a bit of a talking point.
It has, yeah. It hasn't been talked about enough, Matt. So, yes. And that's one of the great challenges is actually how do we enable the conversation that should have been happening years ago? Yeah. And that's something we've been doing for the last 17 years or so. Apologies for my background. I'm having a few technical problems this morning.
No worries.
Hopefully you can still hear me and see me. It's great to be here for Stronger. And I hope just to spend about 25 minutes talking about resilient leadership and how we can recover resilient leadership in a season of deep challenge. I hope that's okay if we can get going. If you're happy, Matt. Let's just spend a moment. It's great to hear Brian just now. Let's just spend a moment just quiet, just letting that settle. What we've just heard, because that's so significant, pressing into confident leadership again and leaning in on the promises of Scripture. Well, I want to help you think about what resilient leadership is for the next 20 minutes or so. And resilience is one of those words which has kind of become quite popular, a bit of a buzzword, a bit like well-being. And leaders can sort of band these words around and speak about them confidently without necessarily drilling into what they actually mean. I think one of the greatest dangers of the ideas around resilient leadership is it's something that you've just got. So some people have this sense of, oh, he's resilient or she's just resilient. As if resilience is a kind of gift and some people have got it and other people are kind of slightly broken or slightly fragile and need to be kind of dealt with very, very sensitively lest they fall off their perch. And I think that's a huge mistake. It's a huge mistake for two reasons. Firstly, it's a huge mistake because it leaves some people believing that they're resilient whatever the weather and that they basically can kind of, deliver whatever life throws at them. And also it leaves other people with a lack of confidence about the fact that they can actually develop greater resilience and leadership. And actually these are muscles to be strengthened. These are tools to be enabled. These aren't just things that you either have or have not. And a key part of our resilience, as we'll hear today, is around our sort of the network of strength that we carry, not just what's within us, but obviously what's within our church communities, what's within our own teams, and also what's within the nature of God, who's equipping us for what we've been called to. I want to refer to a definition of mental health that the World Health Organization uses. And it might not be what you'd expect, because when we often talk about mental health, we talk apparently about pathology. This person is depressed, or this person is anxious, or this person is experiencing unusual phenomenon. But actually, the World Health Organization defines mental health as four things, effectively. Mental health is defined as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. Now, what I love about the World Health Organization's definition is that effectively there are four simple and positive things that denote a resilience in leadership. The first one is that a person can realize their potential. And that's a key gospel motif, that we're created for works that he's prepared in advance for us to do, that we're created in his image, and that we're realizing, if you like, the fullness of the image of Christ within us. Secondly, that you can cope with the normal stresses of life. We'll come back to that in just a moment. Thirdly, that you can work productively and fruitfully. That doesn't mean that you're the biggest winner in the world. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to start a movement or plant tons of churches or start new businesses. It just means that you can be productive and fruitful. And fourthly, that you can make a contribution to his or her community. You can make a contribution to your community. And I think, that's an incredible facet of our resilience in itself, that we are part of a bigger body. And resilience in the world has become quite a self-identifying exercise. I'm resilient in the things that I do, or I'm demonstrating resilience, like I demonstrate strength on the bench press in the gym. But this sort of resilience is actually rooted in community. And I can't think of a better community for it to be rooted in than in the community of the church, where we belong to one another. Let's drill that down a little bit by saying, well, how can I be resilient now? Well, if you think about that second motif in the World Health Organization's diagnostic, it said that you can cope with the normal stresses of life. And in my organization, Mind and Soul Foundation, Rob and Chi-Chi and Kate, who are psychologists and psychiatrists, have been noting within their clinical practice that people are coming in to receive support and treatment who are struggling to cope with life at the moment. And they're encouraging, if you like, a perspective of acknowledging that these aren't normal stresses, that actually the stresses that we've experienced over the last 2 years just aren't normal. And therefore, the level, if you like, of distress, which is matching our circumstances, is actually probably appropriate rather than disordered. If you look at what it looks like to live through a global pandemic for 2 years, then obviously the pressures that we're under mean that we're going to experiencing some greater disturbance. And I think it's so important for leaders to recognize that this isn't meant to be water off a duck's back. If you think back, it's easy to think, oh, well, I've been locked down. Maybe I've not been as active as I once was. But actually, the undercurrent of the pandemic is that you've been plugged into an adrenal drip for 2 years, and your body's just not designed to do that. So whether you've been active or inactive, if your work or ministry or church have been closed or furloughed or on the down low, that doesn't mean that you've been resting and relaxing. What it means is you've been going through a deeply traumatic experience, which actually isn't normal stress. So I'd want to say to anyone on this call today who doesn't feel like they're particularly resilient right now, and they can't kind of work out why, it's okay. There are real sort of genuine experiences that you've had over the last 2 years, which will damage, if you like, your resilience or challenge your mental and emotional health. Don't be, if you like, don't diminish the significance of the experiences you've had. One way in which we struggle with resilience is when we're unable to reach our potential. And our resilience is particularly challenged in seasons when we're inactive rather than active. And many leaders think about resilience as the ability to carry on, carrying huge loads under huge pressure and keeping on going. And in one way, that's a simple way of understanding it, but it's a lot more complex than that. Because sometimes we need to be resilient through periods where we're inactive. If you've ever worked with someone who's unemployed, you'll know what an incredibly stressful circumstance that is. Rather than being a circumstance in which you can rest and relax and recover, actually, your inactivity creates a great challenge to your resilience. An oppressed potential is the phenomenon where actually we're unable to fulfill the normal flow of our day or our week, or the normal functions of our work. And those things are stressful too. Lockdowns are inactive and yet incredibly stressful. So oppressed potential is the inability for us to realize whatever we believe God has called us to realize. And I'm sure that many of us have felt that kind of wobbling of identity. I'm not quite sure who I am because I've lost sight of what I do. Of course, our identity shouldn't be rooted in our activity. It should be rooted in who God says we are. But our activity affirms our gifts, our calling, and our purpose. And so to be inactive is to challenge our resilience. I was teaching back in May 2020 about the traditional phases of collective trauma response. These are the kind of commonly understood flows of human behavior in response to traumatic event. And they flow like this: impact, heroic phase, disillusionment phase, rebuilding phase, and wiser living phase. But the pandemic has also challenged our resilience in the linear way in which we typically deal with challenge. Normally, an event takes place. It might be a significantly challenging event. It might be a catastrophic event, but normally it's a standalone event. And we use our resilience to navigate that territory before we find ourselves flowing out of the other side. But the pandemic has been a stop and start experience. In between 2020 and 2021, there were actually 3 micro phases of that same phenomenon. There was an impact phase, a heroic phase, and a disillusionment phase, but there was no recovery phase or wiser living phase. And that was then repeated 3 times. I was looking at a diagnostic of what happened between 2020 and 2021. And it flows like this in months. Normal, lockdown, 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 stay alert, eat out, rule of 6, tears, lockdown, lockdown, step 1, step 2, step 3, normal, plan B. That level of change and transition is challenging to our resilience because humans are designed for a level of stability. We like to get back to zero and then reorder. And so being in flux all the time is significantly challenging to how we re-stabilize. If you're trying to find your balance on a ship that's going up and down in the waves, it's pretty hard work. You want to find your balance back in the dock. And we haven't had that experience too. So what's it look like to find resilience when you're under pressure? Well, the first thing is to acknowledge the landscape that you're in. We have experienced abnormal stress, and we've also experienced oppressed potential. And those things are affected our ability to work productively and fruitfully. And often we've been isolated against the communities that we want to make contribution to. So our resilience, our health and well-being have been challenged specifically by our experience. And that's aside from all of the normal pressures of our work and leadership. One of my favorite psychologists, Hans Selye, describes 3 universal stages of coping with a stressor. They're an initial fight or flight response, an alarm response when we first encounter the thing that's challenging us. Secondly, a sort of adaptation phase where we're trying to work out how we can settle the challenge that we're facing. And finally, the exhaustion phase where we just feel burnt out by our extension. And when we think about the last couple of years, our resilience has really experienced that over and over and over again. We've had a new alarm as a new variant or new challenge has appeared. We've been in that adrenal phase or fight or flight. Then we've tried to work out how we can fix it. As a church leader myself, we've gone online, in person, online again, in person again. We've mixed the model with online and in person together. We've constantly tried to work out whether we can run the events we're hoping to run, gather the groups we're hoping to gather, do it safely and responsibly. And that constant sense of needing to fix something that's broken is in itself exhausting. So we roll through the adaptation phase into that final stage of exhaustion. And that's a risk because effectively resilience is our ability to come back into shape. I'm sure you remember doing GCSE physics, or maybe even just slightly before that, studying Hooke's law. That's the only bit of physics I really remember. But it was effectively this idea that you put weights on springs to work out how many newtons of load you could apply before the spring bent out of shape. And Hooke's law was the point at which the spring no longer returned to its original form. You could load the spring up with all these heavy Newton weights and it would spring down. And the hope was you take the weights off and it would spring back. But if it didn't spring back, you proved the law. Sometimes it was a lot of heavy weights all together in one moment that would break the spring. But interestingly, if you put heavy weights on the spring and left them there for a really long time, that would often leave the spring gradually overnight extending to the floor until the weights are sitting back down again. Resilience is the ability to flex and stretch, but also return to our original shape. And actually, we're designed to carry quite heavy loads and challenging burdens, but for shorter periods of time. And so when we're trying to support our resilience, it's about acknowledging that we need patterns of rest, patterns of prayer, and patterns of restoration, even in the midst of significant challenge. And that's why what Brian said was so helpful, because our patterns of prayer and spiritual discipline are a core part of what it looks like to be resilient. Not only do they have supernatural benefits, but they also have personal benefits to our health and well-being. Let's delineate then between what productive stress or healthy resilience looks like versus destructive stress or strain and pressure on our resilience. Well, in seasons of productive stress, we have typically a normal appetite and normal sleep. We normally feel quite energized and maybe optimistic and positive. We tend to relate well with others. We have some boundaries, so we know when we can put down our work as well as pick it up. And we have normal anger levels, which is really important in leadership. It's not that we shouldn't be angry, it's that we have regular anger levels. When that weight on the spring is held for too long, we begin to see changes in some of those physiological experiences as well as some of our psychological ones. So the first thing to notice when we begin to find our resilience challenged is changes to our appetite and sleep, maybe eating less or eating more, or maybe sleeping less or sleeping more, potentially feeling lethargic and agitated during the days, pessimistic or unproductive, maybe becoming isolated or hostile to others, having poor boundaries, not being able to stop work, not being able to recreate, not being able to swim or walk or talk to others, having those poor boundaries and then being easily angered and finding yourself angry with everyone, members of your family, people who you love, people you work with, and even at yourself. And so when resilience is challenged, we tend to respond with these different changes that become destructive strain. And we need to make some changes. And I know I've just got a few minutes left, but supporting our resilience is about making positive changes under pressure. One of the key things I want you to take away from today is that you shouldn't wait until your next holiday to find ways of recreation. Recreation means recreation. And I believe very much that God is the recreator. He's the recreator. I love the fact that Sabbath, which Brian again mentioned earlier, is a core part of the heart of God. He recreates, he creates, and then he recreates on the Sabbath and celebrates all that is good. And so waiting until that next holiday, which might be cancelled because of COVID, or waiting several months before you kind of decide to begin patterns and rhythms of rest and recovery, is not a great strategy. What we need is little and often. We need daily retreats, and we need sort of weekly rests, and we need monthly escapes, and we need annual holidays. Three things that we can drop to support our resilience straight away are competition. Actually, when we're struggling with our resilience, the worst thing we can do is begin to compete with others about how well they're doing, because our negative self-talk, bias to the negatives, tends to talk us down in that space and make us want to extend ourselves further, when that's the last thing we actually should be doing. Secondly, the inner critic is that sense that actually I'm talking myself down. Many of the leaders I've coached over the last few months have been saying things like, I'm just not performing like I used to. I feel like I've lost ground. They're very pessimistic. And in their head, there's this little nagging voice that says, you're no good. You should give up. You're useless. All is lost. Your church is half empty. Your business turnover is diminished by a third, or whatever it is. They diminish themselves and they take full responsibility, which isn't actually true. The third thing is linked to the inner critic, and that's catastrophizing. That's the belief that actually there's no way back. And leaders tend to catastrophize because they want to avoid the worst case scenarios. But catastrophizing prepares us for problems that actually we're never going to face. 99.9% of all the things you worry about don't actually happen. It's the things that do happen that you hadn't predicted are the ones that you need to actually be mentally prepared to deal with. Not that you need to know what they are, but to have the resilience to cope with them up front. So catastrophizing is about building castles in the air, things that you don't really need to worry about, but things that you think if you do worry about will somehow protect you. If you worry about an accident happening, it doesn't protect you from the reality of the accident. That's just how it works. So acknowledge competition, the inner critic, catastrophizing, and also what I call compulsive activity. When our resilience is challenged and we're feeling anxious or overstressed, we tend to work harder, not less hard. And actually, we need to retreat in order to advance. We need to pull back, actually, if we're going to find our resilience again. So when you find yourself saying, I can't stop, I've got all of these things to do, that's the moment at which you should stop and say, actually, I've heard that little phrase before. That's a cue for me to say, I'm taking the morning off. I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to take some time and talk to people who understand me. One of my favorite psychologists, another one called Peter Fournier, he says that adversity turns into trauma when the mind experiences itself as being in isolation. And this is a really key message from today, because actually, when we're struggling with our resilience, as I said at the start of this talk, it's not just that we are struggling with a lack within us, it's that we're struggling with a lack within the community that supports us. When we're baptized into the family of faith. We're told that we become the body of the church. We are one with Christ and with one another. And that means that our resources aren't just our resources, they're the resources of the whole church. And many leaders, when their resilience is challenged, see it as a personal mandate to demonstrate their strength. And they can do that spiritually too and say, I don't need support, I just need the Lord. But what if the Lord had provided support in the body of the church, which I think is what he has done, in order that you might get the help that you need? Fornegay says that adversity, their difficult times, become trauma, which is significantly psychologically challenging times, when we experience ourselves living in isolation. And that's why God has called us to be together. He says, two are better than one, because when one falls into a pit, the other one can pull them out. And so when we are under pressure, we're less likely to collaborate, we're less likely to seek support. But at that point, we're actually most likely to benefit from support. So my encouragement is to share your burdens and share them boldly. Demonstrate the reality of what it is to be in your circumstances right now to other people who can listen, care, and make suggestions, if not practically help you out. Fornegay again says the best possible for treatment for trauma is not professional, but social. And when we're going through difficult and challenging times, going through them with others is supportive, transformative, and enables great resilience. But going through them alone means we're depending on meager resources, and we're unlikely to do well in those challenging times. And obviously, don't forget that the Lord is with you through those difficult times. But many Christian leaders say, oh, the Lord is with me, but I've just got to get on with it myself. And that's not exactly the same thing. I want to encourage you to take all of the supports and resources that the Lord has offered you. Practical things you can think about to support your resilience are just boring and routinized things, helpful things that help us tick. Eating well, eating right, and eating at the right time. Sleeping, which is a challenge in itself, and I could give a whole talk on how to regain your sleep, but look up sleep hygiene on the Mind and Soul Foundation site, and you'll find a whole load of articles that will support you to get your sleep back. Working out or exercising to whatever level is safe and good for you. That could be walking for 20 minutes a couple of times a day. It could be a full-blown exercise regime in the gym or a class, but do something to move and engage your body. And then repetition and order. Make sure that you restore order in a time of turmoil by having a personal schedule that you try and stick to. And finally, make sure you're spending time to tap into the resources of God, not just within others, but as Brian has said earlier, in prayer. That we know that prayer is psychologically beneficial as well as supernaturally beneficial. People who pray do better. And part of resilience is, as I said, sharing the load and knowing that God knows you, hears you, understands you, and stands with you is in itself a transformative and powerful construct of your resilience and well-being. So Christian practice, prayerful meditation, creative spiritual expression, and gratitude all have a foundational effect on your ability to continue on. I always remember when Elijah in Kings has fought the prophets of Baal, and he brought down fire on this soaked ram and on the soaked bull, and then Jezebel is after him, and this was sort of pinnacle of his spiritual work. The Lord had sort of demonstrated his power to the people in this moment. And yet, in this time of great turmoil, Elijah's resilience just begins to fade. And he runs out into the desert and he says, Lord, take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. He's had enough. He's completely drained. And I love the way the Lord doesn't say, hey, I've just done an amazing miracle. Look, I brought fire down from heaven, burnt up this great bull. You should be thanking me, not complaining. Instead, the Lord calls him into a deep sleep. He feeds him, calls him to sleep again. He feeds him again, and then he sets him on his way. Very often the ministry of the Lord to us is deeply practical, and it's deeply compassionate. It doesn't bring condemnation, it brings resource. And I want you to look to the Lord at this really difficult and turbulent time in leadership life for resource. Don't look to him for condemnation, for there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. God bless you. I hope that's a starting point when you're thinking about resilience. And I'd love you to send you over to the mindsoulfoundation.org site where we've got tons and tons of resources for you to support your well-being and leadership over the months and years ahead. I'm going to hand back to you, Matt. If you're there, come back and join me.
Thank you very much, Will. That's just been such a great session. Again, two great sessions, one after the other, and like we said at the start, this is such an important thing, especially in the last couple of years to a lockdown. But before that, because it's been, like you said at the start, it's been that one of those things that people don't like to talk about, especially in a faith environment where people are encouraged to stand strong in the Lord, and and it's not wrong to do that. But there's a culture that develops around those kind of things where you just do that and you don't do other things. And so, this has been really encouraging, Will. I just want to, just to kind of tie this up, you mentioned your website where you got some resources and links to. Are there any other groups or websites or books or podcasts that you can recommend that would just help people start that journey of developing and restoring their resilience?
Absolutely. I mean, we've as a team, Dr. Rob Waller, Dr. Kate Middleton, Dr. Chichi Boy, a lot of books associated. Kate's written a brilliant book called Refuel around actually how you can rebuild resilience. Rob and I wrote the worry book, the guilt book, and the perfectionism book together. And I particularly encourage leaders to look at the perfectionism book. And also the power of belonging, which we wrote a couple of years ago, which really frames your leadership in community. Because you're right, there has been quite a machoistic, particularly, I mean, the women are subject to this too, but I think male leaders particularly fall foul of this, a sort of machoistic view of my leadership, even spiritually. I'm going to stand strong in the Lord, and then actually, I have to kind of do that in myself, but I'm not accountable. I'm not receiving support. I won't receive any kindness or compassion from others because I need to sort of be, if you like, a model of what it looks like to demonstrate strength. And unfortunately, over the last couple of years, we haven't just seen leaders' emotional and mental health be damaged. We've also seen the moral fabric of their leadership also falter. And I often think there's three sorts of breakdown. There's mental, physical, and moral. And very often, moral breakdown is still sin, but moral breakdown is often been sort of, if you like, the precursor of moral breakdowns, very often emotional burnout. So we start looking in the wrong places for resource when our emotional and mental resources are flat. And some leaders find it easier to have an affair than to acknowledge that their mental health is poor.
Sure.
As an exit point from ministry. So I just, this is very serious stuff for us to work on. There are some great organizations, as I say, have a look at our site. We try and signpost people to great resources, but I would recommend Kintsugi Hope, which run support groups for people who are going through struggles and challenges, Sanctuary, which run great courses on mental health for churches, Renew, which run, again, great groups for churches around the area of mental health. There are some great networks out there for people in business too. I really like the stuff that Resurgo do on coaching for leadership. If you're a leader and you're feeling like your resilience is really challenged, what I'd say to you is don't wait to get help. The first signs of burnout are challenges to our resilience, which I identified in the destructive strain kind of description there. So if you feel like, oh yeah, I really relate to that, don't wait. It's much easier to come back from a dip in your resilience than it is to come back from real kind of deep burnout. So Get help now, get support now, and you will begin to do much better.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Will. It's been such a great session with you and a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for joining Stronger 2022 conference. What have you got planned for the rest of the day?
Well, my day off today, so my resilience is going for brunch with my wife. I'm going to go for a lovely walk along the river, walk the dog, and just have a relaxing afternoon. That's my day. I look forward to it.
Brilliant.
God
Thank
bless
you so much, Will.
Take care. Goodbye, everyone.
See you soon. Thank you.